Welcome to this recorded pre-departure briefing for students of the College of Arts, Social Sciences and Celtic Studies who will undertake a period of study abroad next semester as part of their University of Galway degree programme. My name is Mary Lyons, and as Mobility Officer for the College of Arts, it's my job to support you before and during your studies abroad. This presentation will also be relevant to College of Arts students who are going on work placement abroad in the coming semester, although in general, these students will have a designated placement officer as their main contact point at the University of Galway. The purpose of this briefing is, first and foremost, to help you prepare for your mobility experience by offering you information and advice on the topics shown here. I'm going to start by working through a checklist of items that you'll need to attend to before your departure, and looking at a few of them in more detail. I'll discuss the subject of accommodation, and even more importantly, accommodation scams and how to recognise and avoid them. Then I'm going to talk a bit about culture shock, what it is, how to recognise it, and how you can deal with it. I'll make some suggestions for how to get the most out of your time abroad based on the experiences of former students. Needless to say, your safety and welfare are really important, so I'll offer some advice in this regard and make some suggestions as well for what you can do when things don't go according to plan. Finally, I will describe the mobility assessment and student declaration, which are requirements of the University of Galway for all students taking part in international activities. At this stage in your preparations, I hope that you all know where your passport is, and that you've made sure that it's valid for the full duration of your mobility period. In fact, for some countries, you'll be required to have a passport that's valid for up to several months after your planned departure, so if you're in doubt, do check that right away. A personal travel insurance policy is mandatory for every student of this university who goes abroad as part of their degree programme. That's in addition to the EHIC, which is necessary if you're an EU citizen going to another EU country. Do set up online banking, especially if you're on Erasmus, as it'll be useful for keeping track of your grant payments. Speaking of which, I know that the majority of you are going on Erasmus, and can I please ask you to pay careful attention to the requirements of the programme. Be sure to read the information handbook and the material on the Erasmus website. I'll return in a moment to the topic of accommodation, as I know it's a concern for many of you. Every Irish citizen who's going abroad ought to register with the Department of Foreign Affairs, just in case you ever need consular assistance while you're away. An international student identity card is worth considering. It will get you discounts on lots of things: shopping, travel, entertainment, entry to museums and galleries. You can apply for it either here or in your destination country. Or, if you're going to study abroad under Erasmus, you might find an ESN card useful. ESN is the Erasmus Student Network. Their card is free and can give you discounts on a range of things, including Ryanair and Flixbus, which is the low-cost, long-distance bus company that operates around Europe. You'd apply for the ESN card not here, but at your host university if it has a branch of the ESN, and very many universities do. Do some research into these cards and what benefits they might bring for you. If you think you might want to get a new SIM card while abroad, make sure your phone is unlocked. Finally, make sure you understand the requirements of your course and how many credits you need. And if you're studying abroad, ensure that you know who your academic coordinators are, both here and at your host university. Some of you will have been lucky enough to secure a room in a university residence abroad. It's perhaps worth mentioning that Galway students sometimes observe that the level of comfort in student residences in some other countries is not always on a par with what they were used to here. It's true that facilities can be quite basic, and you can end up sharing kitchens and bathrooms with quite a few people. On the other hand, a residence offers great opportunities to get to know other students, as well as reasonably priced and secure accommodation with utility bills included. If you're going to be renting instead on the private market, you'll need to do some research in advance to find out what part of the city would be most convenient for you in terms of distance to your classes or your place of work, and what the public transport connections are like. You should also find out what the going rate of rent is. You'll certainly need to have enough money to pay a deposit, and especially in the case of France, you might need to bring a letter of guarantee from your parents. Always read the small print in your rental contract and make sure you understand the conditions in relation to the notice period that applies and what happens if you break your lease. When you move into your accommodation, if you see that there's something missing or damaged, make a note of this and report it to the landlord or caretaker. Otherwise, you could be blamed for this and lose your deposit at the end. But by the same token, if you're responsible for causing damage to your accommodation or you don't take care with its upkeep and cleaning, you could lose your deposit at the end of your lease period. In this regard, be aware of possible problems with mold or mildew. Pay attention to ventilation and make sure to air out your room by opening windows regularly, but of course only when it's safe to do so, and never go out of your accommodation leaving an open window that could be an access point for burglars. Use common sense in this regard. Remember also that living in an environment that has mold or mildew can have very serious long-term health implications, so be firm with your landlord if such an issue needs to be addressed. Subletting arrangements are generally not advisable. That would be where you'd rent from another student who's going away temporarily, rather than rent directly from the landlord. You will not have the same rights as if you had a proper lease, and you may have problems if, for instance, something needs to be repaired or replaced. It's your decision, but I would say proceed with caution. Think carefully about who you want to share with. Sharing accommodation with your Galway friends, or even people from Ireland, can seem reassuring and comfortable, but in fact it can limit your opportunities to get to know other international students or to practice your language if you're a language student. Above all, when you're looking for accommodation, be on the lookout for rental scams, which have become very common. There are definitely sharks out there on the rental market, and it's wise to approach any rental situation with a degree of caution. How do you spot an accommodation scam? I'd advise you to Google the topic of rental scams so that you're aware of some of the telltale signs. The list here is not exhaustive, but it does show a few things that might raise a red flag for you. Rent, for instance, that's noticeably out of step with the going rate for the type of accommodation in the particular location. If it looks too good to be true, it very likely is. Scam ads will often feature bad spelling or grammar, and scammers tend to contact their victims via social media or WhatsApp and will cease communicating with you once they've got your money. If the person spins you a story about not being able to meet you in person to show you the property, or renting on behalf of a relative, it could be a warning sign. Typically, a scammer will adopt a pushy approach, telling you that there are several other people interested and that you'll need to make your mind up quickly. Needless to say, they'll demand money up front, and paying money up front for accommodation that you haven't seen is never advisable. Don't allow yourself to be pressurized. A genuine landlord will understand your reticence about upfront payments. A responsible landlord who cares about their property won't want to sign you up without knowing if you'll be a responsible and careful tenant and able to pay your rent. If a scammer feels that they're managing to reel you in, they may well start to introduce additional charges, an extra month's rent on the advice of their lawyer, for instance, or legal fees, or cleaning fees. Above all, a request for payment via a Western Union money transfer, PayPal, or some other payment method that can't be reversed or traced is always highly suspicious. With a credit card transaction, for instance, you have some chance of stopping the payment if you have second thoughts directly after making the transfer, or at least the transaction and destination account can be traced. With a Western Union money transfer, you will almost certainly have no hope of ever recovering the funds. As I said, stay calm and don't allow yourself to be pressurized, and don't feel bad about questioning anything you're uneasy about. It's no harm to do a bit of research online and try to verify the person's identity. Maybe it's a letting agency. This may well be genuine, but make sure the website and the rental ad are genuine and not cloned from a legitimate website. Look up the address of the property and see if anything sets off alarm bells. Also, keep in mind that some bogus accommodation ads might appear in a number of different cities. Be on the lookout for inconsistencies and trust your gut feeling. Unless you're renting through a reputable accommodation agency, you should really only hand over money when you have been able to establish that the property exists and that the keys fit in the locks. Only set up a bank transfer for rental payments when you're satisfied that everything is in order, and you should always ensure that you get a proper rental contract. A European Health Insurance Card, or EHIC, is mandatory for every EU citizen travelling to another EU state. You can obtain this by applying online through the EHIC website, but do this in plenty of time, allowing for holiday periods and possible backlogs. If you already have an EHIC, make sure it won't expire while you're abroad. Private insurance is mandatory for every University of Galway student going abroad to study or work as part of their degree programme here. You are of course free to choose your own insurance provider and insurance policy, but please do read the small print and satisfy yourself that the policy you choose is adequate for your needs and covers all of the items listed here. There are some providers who offer insurance packages tailor-made for students on long-term mobility. Generally, they'll satisfy these conditions and will be competitively priced, but do always read the small print and be aware of any exclusions. Some examples of insurance providers that we know University of Galway students have used are shown here. If you're an Erasmus student, please read carefully the detailed information on this topic in your handbook. And even if you're not going on Erasmus, you might find it useful to read this too for general guidance in relation to insurance. One thing that you absolutely should do is go onto the Department of Foreign Affairs website, the Know Before You Go section, and look up the advice there for your destination country. It will cover topics like safety and security, local laws, any public health concerns, and so on. If you're an Irish citizen, we strongly recommend that you register your contact details with the Department of Foreign Affairs. This will be useful if, for instance, you need consular assistance in an unforeseen situation, such as being the victim of serious crime or having your passport stolen, suffering a serious illness or a family emergency, or some situation where your family needs assistance in contacting you. Consular assistance would also be relevant if you were in a dangerous situation due to some crisis like a natural disaster or civil unrest. You should note the details of the Irish Embassy or Consulate in your destination country. For those of you who are going abroad to study at another university, the first days are exciting, but they can also be a little bewildering and confusing. But there's almost always help and support available for newly arrived international students. If your host university offers an orientation program before the start of teaching, you should definitely take part. It'll be a chance for you to meet the staff of the international office there, to get to know other students, and to get an introduction to the university and the city or town. There may be social events or outings organised, and you'll likely get an introduction to the local culture. Some universities offer a buddy programme. That's where local students volunteer to be paired with a newly arrived international student to help them settle in. Your buddy might even meet you at the train or bus station. They'll be able to show you around and give you tips and advice from a student perspective. If there's a language course on offer, even if you aren't a language student, do take advantage of it, as this will usually be both enjoyable and useful and a great way to get an appreciation of the culture. You shouldn't expect everything to go perfectly smoothly to start with, and a bit of chaos and uncertainty is to be expected in those early days. You may experience feelings of homesickness or even culture shock, and I'll look at that in more detail in a minute. One simple tip I always give students is to make yourself aware of how the local public transport system works, and whether you need to validate or stamp your ticket in a machine, either outside or inside the bus or tram. Inspectors can pop up unexpectedly, and if you're found not to have a validated ticket, you could be fined, and in most cases, being a foreigner or not speaking the language won't be accepted as an excuse. Culture shock will affect the majority of students on mobility to some extent. It's part of the process of adjustment to a new environment, and it can be triggered by differences that you'll notice between your life as you now know it and your new life abroad. These differences can seem like simple things, but in combination, they can produce feelings of disorientation and discomfort. It could be the unfamiliar food or the fact that mealtimes aren't when you're used to eating. Maybe you're not a fan of hot weather, or maybe you'll struggle a little in a country where the winter is colder and darker than here. Maybe you don't speak any of the language, or you might be a language student who finds that the language you've been learning is spoken differently here. Maybe too fast, maybe with a strong regional accent, or maybe people are speaking in a dialect so that it's hard to communicate and make yourself understood. Maybe, coming from Ireland, you're fazed by the more direct communication style of some cultures. Maybe there are customs and traditions that are totally alien to you. Once again, here's a list of the common causes of culture shock. And another thing that I should mention which can trip you up and cause uncertainty and embarrassment is the level of formality that you should use when communicating with people in another language. The beauty of English, of course, is that we don't have the dilemma of formal or informal modes of address, which feature in many European languages. While it's safe to assume that you can use the informal mode of address with other students, in dealing with other people like university staff, you should err on the side of caution and take your cue from the person you're speaking to. In some cultures, there's also a lot of emphasis on titles, particularly when dealing with academic staff, and it's best to keep this in mind, especially in written communications like emails. It's worth noting that while students here in Galway often address their lecturers by their first names, this isn't necessarily the norm at universities abroad. Respect and good manners always create a good impression, particularly where staff are busy dealing with large numbers of international students. So how does culture shock manifest itself? This is a light-hearted take on the whole process of adjusting to a new environment. You'll recognise that phase right at the start where you're by turns excited and fearful as you prepare for the move abroad. Then you arrive at your destination, and for most students there'll be a honeymoon phase where you're caught up in the novelty of everything. There are people to get to know, places to see, social events, get-togethers, outings. The sights and sounds can seem invigorating, and those of you who haven't lived away from home before may really enjoy the sense of freedom. You'll be aware that so much is different and new, but at this stage it all seems stimulating and fun. And then, at some point, you come back to earth with a bang. You'll start to notice and perhaps become bothered by some of the differences I've mentioned. You may experience frustration at not being able to get things done because procedures and systems are different. You might struggle with the language or find yourself upset because of communication problems or people's reactions to you. Now you may start to feel homesick, missing people and routines you've left behind. You might even start to think you've made a mistake in moving abroad. This crisis phase is unsettling, but it should pass. It could also return at any stage, but you'll have learned by then that it's a temporary phase. Please remember that all of this is normal, and if you're homesick, it might help if I tell you that the students who are most homesick at the start are often the ones who are most upset when the time comes to return home after their study abroad. You will work your way through the frustrations and gradually adjust, although it may take some effort. But you'll slowly become more familiar and comfortable with the new culture, the language, the ways of doing things. You'll gain in confidence and eventually you'll find that you've adapted and are at ease in your new home. There is a further phase, reverse culture shock, that occurs after you return home, and you may struggle a little to readjust, but that's a topic for a later date. What might culture shock feel like? Essentially, it's a feeling of disorientation due to a new environment, but it can take the form of psychological or physical symptoms: alienation, boredom, withdrawal, isolation, irritation, homesickness, aches and pains. In that crisis phase, you may experience frustration, uncertainty, and distress. But if you can persevere and work through it, you will reach the stages of adjustment and adaptation. How can you deal with culture shock? First of all, you must remember that this is a perfectly normal reaction and you're certainly not alone. Reaching the adjustment stage takes time and some perseverance. Be patient with yourself and remember that going abroad to study or work is not just about learning academic things, but is a much more profound experience that involves learning about yourself, developing as a person, and getting to know another culture in a way that you could not possibly do without actually living in it. Often the greatest learning is from the most challenging situations. It's important to look after your well-being. Try to eat well, exercise, stay hydrated, and get enough sleep. Tiredness, as you know, can make a tough situation seem much worse. Socializing and partying are a big feature of an international year or semester, but if you are feeling low, alcohol is not your friend, but can completely distort your perception of things and even make you depressed. It can be helpful to have some things around you that remind you of home, maybe photographs, familiar objects, your favorite foods. It can also be nice to chat to family and friends at home. But I would suggest that you don't become overly reliant on these links with home to the point where you lose out on the immediate experience on your doorstep. It's really important to find ways to integrate and get involved in things, to get out of your room and challenge yourself a little. Maybe there's a hobby or something you're passionate about. Maybe there's a way of linking that with your new life so that you can form connections with people. Is there an Irish sport or music club where you might meet local people who love Irish culture so that you have something in common with them? Some other hobby that you'd like to pursue while getting to know people? Would you consider volunteering, doing something meaningful that would connect you with your local community? Above all, be conscious of your mood, and if you find yourself really struggling to adapt, you should ask for help. You could try the international office of your host university and ask them to direct you to local supports, or you could contact student counselling at the University of Galway. I've included a link here at the bottom of the page to a University of Galway site with a whole wealth of resources for mental health and well-being. Here are some final tips for dealing successfully with culture shock. You can take steps to lessen its impact by learning as much as you can about your destination country and the new culture before you go there. So do some research before you go. Find out about the styles of communication, traditions, the typical foods, what time of day people eat, the political system, the mentality, styles of dress, which side of the road they drive on, even seemingly trivial things like the law in relation to jaywalking, the currency if you aren't going to a Eurozone country. Yes, a lot of this is part of the journey of discovery that study or working abroad, but being a bit prepared will remove some of the confusion and frustration you might experience when you notice cultural differences. Remember that you're not alone in what you're experiencing. If you can approach things with openness, curiosity, and humour, you'll find the differences less unsettling. Just because things are done differently doesn't mean the way of doing things is wrong, it's just different. And in that regard, if you find yourself becoming unduly critical of your host country, please remember that you're a guest there and that you should always show respect for that country and its people. Here's some really good advice from one of our former Erasmus students, and indeed it applies to any study abroad experience. Make as many friends as possible at the start so you don't feel homesick. You can really enjoy the experience by getting to know not just the country's culture, but other international students' cultures as well. It really is the experience you make it to be. Absorb everything new, but practice the same common sense you would living away from home in Ireland. The first few weeks can be tough adjusting, but if you want to make the most of your Erasmus or any international student experience, outside your comfort zone is where the magic happens. There's no doubt that what you get out of your international experience will be in direct proportion to what you put in. Looking ahead, it may seem like a long time, but it will go by faster than you can imagine, and I would advise you to make the most of every day. As that student said, it's about getting out of your comfort zone, and you can set yourself little challenges that will give you a sense of achievement and progress. Another student remarked that confidence and endurance are necessary characteristics for the time abroad, but the payoff will be huge. Do your best to assimilate with both native and other international students. Particularly if you're a language student, you may have to make an extra effort to practice your language so that you don't end up speaking English all the time. Maybe try a conversation exchange or tandem, where you agree to speak English one week and the other language the next. Even if you're not a language student, but you're in a country where English is not the first language, if you can make the effort to learn and use a little of the native language, you'll find that people really appreciate this and respond to you more positively. If you have opportunities to travel at the weekends and see more of the country or neighbouring countries, by all means avail of that. But don't forget to get to know the city where you're living either. Try to be open-minded in your approach to things. As I've said, you can be aware of cultural differences, but try to embrace them as well. If life abroad was exactly as it is here, there'd be no point going there. Study abroad is really the gift that keeps on giving, and it's actually later on, after you've returned, when you'll fully appreciate all that you've gained and learned. Think about writing a journal or even publishing a blog. Maybe keep a photographic record of your experiences that you could turn into a video, so that you can look back on it all later and maybe inspire other students too. Finally, please don't neglect your studies. That's the primary reason you're going away after all. So try to establish a routine and be diligent about your academic work so that you don't end up in a state of panic when exam time comes around. In recent years, we've seen a tendency for students based in mainland Europe or the UK to pop home to Ireland for the weekend, and we would discourage this. It interrupts the momentum and makes it harder for you to settle back in. It robs you of precious time that you could have spent doing something interesting in your host country, and you should also think in terms of your carbon footprint and unnecessary air travel. It's to be hoped that you will have a very enjoyable and positive experience abroad, but you also need to take precautions in relation to your personal safety to ensure that you avoid unpleasant incidents as much as possible. You don't want to become paranoid or spend the time looking over your shoulder, but you should develop a healthy awareness of risk and not take chances. Excessive alcohol consumption can lead to embarrassing incidents, unpleasantness with neighbours, and encounters with the police, and it can also jeopardise your safety, so please, if you drink, drink responsibly. Please read the yellow safety advice sheet, and remember also that we expect you to observe the University of Galway Code of Conduct while you're abroad. When you arrive at your destination with a large amount of luggage, be very vigilant at rail or bus stations, which are a classic spot for opportunist thieves. In general, when out and about, especially in a large city, try not to look lost or conspicuous and avoid carrying valuables or large amounts of cash. Keep cash and phones, etc. out of sight. If you can, avoid carrying your passport on a day-to-day basis. It's better to carry a passport card or even a photocopy of your passport. Keep your accommodation locked, and even if you're in a student residence, you should lock your door even if you're just popping out for a short time. Exercise caution generally, especially when out at night, and look out for each other. As I mentioned already, drink alcohol responsibly, and please read our yellow safety advice sheet. The key message is don't take risks and heed your gut feeling if you sense that there is a risk. Some situations are potentially risky, of course. It's not advisable to be out alone at night, especially in a place you don't know very well. Even if you've become familiar with the city, you shouldn't take chances when out after dark. You should never go off somewhere at night on your own without telling someone where you're going. This applies regardless of whether you're male or female. You should identify and avoid districts that are known to be unsafe, and after dark, avoid deserted areas, public parks, and badly lit streets and alleyways. In fact, even in daylight, some public parks may be unsafe. You should avoid walking home alone late at night, try to travel in groups or take a taxi. And keep away from political rallies and demonstrations, which can attract extremists and can end in violence. Remember also that in some countries, as an international student, you could end up being deported if you're suspected of being involved in extremist political activities. A few final points about safety and welfare. It's a good idea to save local emergency numbers in your phone, the police for instance, just in case you ever find yourself in a situation where you might need to call them in a hurry. You might want to register with a doctor in your host town or city. And if you have a medical condition and you're going to be in a non-English speaking environment, take translated copies of any documentation and ensure that you'll be able to get your medication. You'll notice when you look at the Department of Foreign Affairs guidance for many countries that there's a high degree of caution advised in relation to possible terrorist attacks. Now, such incidents are indeed rare, and it's unlikely you'll ever have to deal with one. But as always, you should know what to do in such a situation. You should always follow the instructions of the local police or authorities. Avoid crowded areas, stay indoors if possible, and don't hesitate to report anything suspicious to the police. Look to your host university or your host organisation for guidance or advice, especially if you have any concerns. Above all, make sure to make contact with your family if there's any chance they're going to be alarmed if they see news reports of an incident where you are. I've already mentioned the University of Galway Code of Conduct and how our students abroad are expected to abide by it. Please remember that while abroad, you are an ambassador for your country and for your university. Bad behaviour by University of Galway students damages the reputation of the university, but it can also have repercussions for future students who may find themselves disadvantaged or discriminated against when it comes to finding accommodation, for instance. Please show respect for your host country, its people and its customs. Keep in touch with us while you're abroad. We love to hear from students and to know how they're getting on. If problems should arise, don't hesitate to contact either me as your mobility officer, or your University of Galway academic coordinator, or the International Affairs Office. Or if you're in distress, do contact the University of Galway Counselling Service. Remember to keep in touch with your family while you're away, and to check your University of Galway email account on a regular basis, otherwise you could miss important messages because that will be our main means of communication with you. You remain a registered student of the University of Galway while you're abroad, and as such, you can continue to avail of services like student counselling, which offers support both for ongoing mental health issues and problems that might arise while you're abroad. If mental health issues arise during your time abroad and you're not already registered with the counselling service, you can simply email counselling@universityofgalway.ie. Registration forms will be sent to you and a preliminary online assessment can be organised. And then assessments and counselling sessions are offered via Teams or Zoom. A quick reminder about Erasmus paperwork. Like I said, it's really important that Erasmus students read carefully the information that they've been provided with. They should consult the relevant web pages listed here and make sure to deal with paperwork promptly. Students sometimes get confused when they're filling in the Erasmus Learning Agreement, in that they're not quite sure who the responsible person is. Well, that's the person who must review and approve your course choices, in other words, your academic coordinator, and you'll find a full list of all academic coordinators at the back of the Erasmus Handbook. The contact person can be me, Mary Lyons, but the responsible person must be your academic coordinator, not me. You'll find more information about the Learning Agreement at the web page listed here. Finally, there are 2 documents that you'll need to attend to before your departure. The first is the mobility assessment, which I'll send you by email. It's an online form that you must complete no less than 2 weeks before you're due to travel abroad. It will require you to consider topics like travel, risks, health issues and safety. At the end of it, it has 2 questions relating to the Student Declaration. The Student Declaration is a separate document. It's all about your responsibilities regarding academic performance, good conduct, your health, insurance, safety and risks, etc. And I will send you that declaration by email. Please read it carefully, as you will be asked to indicate your agreement to it in the mobility assessment. Thank you very much for your attention, and please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions you may have. My email address is mary.lyons@universityofgalway.ie.